either by raising your digital hand. You may also submit question via the chat at any time if you do not wish to speak. The recording also will be made available and will be emailed to all of you and shared on the social media and on the website, the center's website. So, like I said, we are really pleased and delighted that the Gilli, although she's extremely busy, but she has kindly accepted to do this webinar, this talk. Just a brief introduction about Gilli. I think, to be honest, I can go forever about Gilli. She's so busy and she's been doing so many things in the field. So Gilli's, for the moment, she's the Associate Director of Reusefully Limited. And she has provided technical and expert input to sustainability and resource efficiency related project in the built environment for nearly 30 years now. Until 2021, she was at BRE, where she had a lot of roles. One of them was the director in the strategic advisory team, working across low carbon buildings, circular lean construction, renewable energy technology, sustainable communities, and so forth in the UK and internationally as well. In this role, she has also led BRE work on the resource efficiency and circular economy. Recently, she's been working as a circular economy advisor to London Borough of Enfield on the Meridian Water Regeneration Project. And she has as well been undertaking various projects, such as the ongoing European Commission project related to measurement of circularity approaches in the construction ecosystem. Gilli is a member of several sustainability and circular economy standard committees. I'm just going to note just a few of them. The European CEN Technical Committee 350 on circular economy and construction, which is at the same time, Gilli is the chair of the UK mirror of this European standard, which at the BSI committee. She's also a member of the ISO Circular Economy, which is SCP-14, which is a committee responsible for standardization in the field of circular economy. So that's very, very briefly about Gilli. In terms of her presentation, Gilli's talk will focus on the development of standards that will support the transition from linear to circular economy in the construction industry. First of all, she will explore the most immediate standardization work to highlight both existing standards at a European level and at a UK level, and indicate where specific standardization gaps and solutions have been proposed, which will be very relevant to the work of our center research projects. And then finally, Gilli will highlight some relevant standardization endeavors by the UK government and the European Commission as an indication of future trends with respect to circular economy. So that's just a brief introduction to Gilli and her talk. Please, Gilli, the floor is all yours and you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Mo. And thanks everybody for joining us. I know that standards might not be the most riveting subject for everybody, but it is, you know, it's quite an important aspect, because I think by producing standards, by having standards, we can sort of get where we need to go a bit faster and more effectively. So I have sort of invested some of my time in that process. So just a bit about Reusefully. I probably won't go into too much about this since you know all about me now. But we set up, myself and colleague Catherine Adams and some other colleagues set this up to really focus on circular economy in the built environment, to sort of bring our many years experience into various projects from quite sort of development based, so practical on the ground, implemented circular economy, all the way up to one of the projects I'll talk about, which is providing recommendations to the European Commission on measuring circularity. So very varied portfolio. So just to start the ball rolling, what are standards? So actually, I was thinking, I don't really know what's the definition of a standard, and the BSI definition is a standard is an agreed way of doing something. And that's in my head, that's pretty much what it is. And it could be a product or a process or delivering a service or supplying materials. But I think that pretty much sums it up. And so the key thing in there is an agreed way of doing something, because I think there's lots of work in circular economy. And there's lots of really good things happening in circular economy, but there tends to be a lack of consensus in terms of how we should do things in circular economy, how we should measure things. So even the basic stuff like what is circular economy, there's multiple definitions, as is, what's the scope of circularity, how do you do it, what are the processes that are involved, and an area that I've been getting very involved in, how do you actually measure it, and what's the data you therefore need to measure it. And then there's also, obviously, within the built environment, there's a whole raft of existing standards, primarily developed to look at sort of more like the linear economy. So there's a fair amount of work that we do need to do to update and amend these current standards to be able to enable circularity outcomes. We've got an image here. So myself and Mo worked on this series of BSI standards, looking at designing for material efficiency and building projects. So there's a number of parts, there's 3 parts have been published. And it was, it was a really useful exercise in terms of bringing the whole value chain together to try to determine, in this instance, what's material efficiency and how do you what the processes that you need to go through to embed it into building projects from the very early stages all the way through to, the in-use phases. So there are standards around, this being one of them, but there are also many gaps, particularly in this sort of newer area of circular economy. And there's activity happening at different levels. So if you see ISO, that means it's an international standard. CEN relates to European standards, and BSI are the British standards, though they tend to be aligned with either European norms, ENs, or ISO standards, and sometimes both. PAS stands for Publicly Available Specifications, so that can be produced by BSI. And these are effectively fast-track standardization documents, more linked to sort of good practices. But these are sort of more rapid to produce, essentially. And then we also get other standards. So, for example, the BREEAM technical criteria form part of the sustainability standard for BREEAM, and there are other sustainability standards out there. I'll probably have to say that, no, I'm not BRE. Other sustainability standards do exist, like DGMB in Germany, and Levels, which is more of a European sustainability standard for buildings. And when you look at circularity, there are lots of opportunities. As I say, it hasn't really been defined yet, but this is it's a table that I've used for quite a few years just to look at what the opportunities are, because if you sort of produce this or you look at this, you can see that it's not necessarily a simple set of approaches or things that we're looking at. So we could be looking very much from things like the design for future disassembly, etc., but then also things like new business models, and then at the end of life or the end of use, how do we sort of standardize aspects of recycling, even the definition, so closed loop versus open loop recycling. So there's lots of activity, there's lots of opportunities, but there's also not much harmonization in terms of defining what these are and how to do them and then how to measure them. So this is where the sort of information management of metrics and data sets are quite fundamental across all of these. And then to add into this mix of, circularity can mean lots of things, is the fact that actually circularity also means looking across multiple life cycles, something which many of the standards that we've been very used to using in the built environment have not done, because they've been focused on one building life cycle, essentially, when looking at sustainability. But when you're looking at circularity, it's a minimum of 3 life cycles that we're interested in, because we're interested in what's already here. So the buildings, the material banks that are in the current built environment. We're also interested in the future built environment, and that's where we're sort of thinking of things like designing for future reuse and creating another bank of resources. And then in the middle, we've got our current building or the building or the asset that we're designing and constructing now. and we're trying to sort of reduce the impact of that through maybe incorporating materials from this existing built environment, but also thinking about things like designing for adaptability and flexibility to enable that to last longer, so that we can actually have assets that are used more effectively and actually can be retained in use for a longer period of time. So it's much more systems-based thinking and multiple life cycle thinking when you're looking at circular economy. But we still don't really have a definition for it. There's the one that's keeping resources in the highest value for as long as possible. So that's the one that many of us use. And a few years ago, an ISO technical committee was set up, so 323, which is all about standardization in the field of circular economy. So this is a general standards body, international standards committee, looking across different sectors, not just construction. And the national, so BSI is the national standards body for the UK, and the committee that is linking into this ISO TC 323 is SCP 1-4, circular economy. And actually quite recently we've started to get the first draft standards coming out of this ISO TC 323 body. They've been at work for a few years, and now we're starting to get the first draft standards. And this is subject to change, but I've extracted one of the definition of circular economy from one of these draft standards that's out for consultation at the moment for circular economy. So an economic system that uses a systemic approach to maintain a circular flow of resources, which has its own definition, by recovering, retaining, or adding to their value, which again has another definition, whilst contributing to sustainable development. So I suppose what can be seen from that is, we've got a definition potentially that's going through consultation, but it's also, it then refers to other definitions. And this is quite a standard way that these sort of framework documents are produced. So where there's an existing definition in an existing standard, then they tend to sort of use that. They almost recycle those definitions. And then where they don't exist, then there's a lot of consultation and discussion to create effectively a new definition for a term that as yet doesn't have an official standardized definition. So hopefully in a few months' time, we will actually have the, a standard definition for circular economy and aspects of circular economy that we can all refer to. And this is the draft framework standard from whence I took that definition. It's actually out for consultation at the moment. So you can BS ISO, so that essentially means it's come through the British Standards national body, standards body, NSB, National Standards Body, to be able to collect feedback from from the UK and then feed it back to the international committee, this ISO TC 323, on various aspects of the objectives, aims, definitions, all in relation to circular economy, but again not necessarily linked to construction. This is much more general standard looking across various economic sectors. So this is actually out for consultation at the moment till the 17th of June. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a timeline in terms of, what are the different processes that it's gone through. So it's already gone through the proposal stage, the draft stage, and it's now at the public comment stage. So everybody that can get access to this to be able to then provide those public comments. And then there's a process to collect all these comments and then produce another version that then will effectively go out to be voted on by the national standards bodies. So the circular economy working groups that have been set up under this international standard, here's a list of them here. So you can see that effectively one has reported back. So working group 1, which is terminology, principles and framework management system, they've produced their draft framework standard, which is out for consultation. But there are a number of other working groups that are focusing on things like, for example, measuring and assessing circularity, and also the product circularity data sheet, which is going to be quite an important development as and when that's produced as a standard. And then there are also joint working groups. So this one, for example, on secondary materials is effectively working jointly with this ISO standards committee. So there are other drafts out. So there are 2 other drafts out. One is related to guidelines on business models and value chain. So the deadline for that is 7th of June. And this next one, which is very much a topic dear to my heart, is about measuring circularity. So that's the deadline for that is 11th of June. And this one was a particular interest to Reusefully, because we're involved in a European Commission study that is looking at measuring circularity. And I'll just show. So this infographic is really just to give an idea of what this project's about. So started in June last year. It's finishing this week, so hence we're quite busy. So we're just finalising the report, and so things aren't going to change too much. But essentially, we've got recommendations for 21 core indicators, 19 supplementary indicators. We've looked at 4 levels of measuring circularity, so the product material level, building infrastructure level, organisational level, and urban level. And we've essentially looked at learnings from multiple case studies. We've had interviews with key stakeholders. We've had 2 workshops, pan-European workshops. We've also had 2 surveys that went across the EU or across Europe, as well as reviewing. I think we reviewed about 200 websites as well as other data sources. So we sort of pulled that all together to come up with these recommendations for how to measure circularity, and then what units should be used, and then what data would be needed to support those measurements. So this is quite an important aspect of standardization that is running separately to the sort of standardization work that I've outlined. But actually, in effect, it will, if implemented, whatever recommendations are taken up, they will effectively become a standard by default, because they'll be embedded into the EU in terms of how they want to effectively measure circularity with the value chain that's indicated here. So going a bit more into the standardization world of the construction sector, circular economy. So there is a subcommittee that is circular economy in the construction sector. It's been going since June 21, so it's almost 2 years it's been running for. And there are 3 working groups at the moment. So working group 1, similar to the international standard, there's looking at framework definitions, circular economy in the construction sector. Working group 2, which I've been heavily involved in the gap analysis and recommendations for further work. So what are the standardization priorities when we look at circular economy in the construction sector? And then working group 3 is the advisory group, which is trying to, one of the aspects of the advisory group is to be able to have much closer alignment with what's happening at the EU level in terms of policy development, for example. We do have a mirror committee, so that's B558/1 is the British mirror committee to this European committee. And if you recognise those numbers, it's probably because TC350 and B558 are effectively sustainability construction works. So they're the parent committee, effectively, to this circular economy and construction sector. And so, for example, some of the standards that the parent committees are responsible for are, for example, the EN 15804, so environmental product declarations of construction products. So it's sort of coming from that angle, but there's lots of linkages to other British standards and European standards that need to be factored into that process. So we carried out a gap analysis to be able to just work out what do we think are the immediate gaps and the immediate priorities for standardization in circular economy construction sector. So we identified as working group 2, we identified 40 preliminary gaps, and they were sent out to all the national standards bodies and beyond to do some prioritization and to see if we've missed any. So are there any additional gaps that we hadn't picked up on? So we received quite a good level of response from all these countries, letters for buildings, and so these were basically, these 40 preliminary gaps were set across these 9 thematic areas, which are listed here, and they're also ranked in terms of the prioritisation. So generally, each of these thematic areas were ranked. So probably not surprising, the top one that was considered a need for standardisation was generally around planning and design for circularity. So it didn't really surprise us that those are the sort of areas. So the planning, design, the actual construction, and then the sort of end of life aspects were generally considered a higher priority for standardisation. And I won't go too much into it, but just to see that, you know, each of these 40 gaps was sort of ranked from 1 to 40. So there wasn't sort of, an immediate correlation in terms of how they were ranked. But then, having sort of got all that information together, reviewed all the comments and also the additional gaps that are identified, we sort of established the following recommendations as working group 2 in terms of setting up new working groups. And I'm just going to go through these sort of individually, so I won't read them out here. But there were quite a few of the gaps and comments were related to aims or definitions, and those are already being addressed by working group 1, so those have been relayed to that working group. So one of the key ones, as I'm sure won't be a surprise, is data measurement and assessment linked to circular economy. So there's a real need to be able to measure at these different levels, so the product material level, but also the infrastructure building level, environmental, social and economic. So we do have existing environmental sustainability assessment tools like LCA, economic assessment, LCC, and there are some social value assessments. So it's really to understand what isn't already covered by those existing tools, or the other boundaries set in a way that doesn't really support effectively the transition to circular economy. So we sort of developed some preliminary work items and identified some of the links, like the very strong links that we need to make should such a working group be set up. And those are shown there. So probably no surprise, the sort of digital passports, product passport work that's going on at the moment is quite important to this, as are the sort of technical committees for the key product groups, for example. So that was the first working group that we identified. Then reuse came up very strongly. So the need to have quality assurance and support quality assurance in terms of reuse of what's in the existing built environment. So not so much looking at designing for future reuse. This is very much focused on what's already here and how do we optimize what's already here, what the standardization needs. I haven't got time to go through all of it, but one of the key things is that reuse can be at very different levels. So it can be the building or the asset level. It can be a component and product level, but it can also be at a material level. And each of those requires slightly different, it's got slightly different requirements in terms of supporting that retention or that future reuse, essentially. And so these are some of the examples of activities that we've said are quite important to look at in terms of this quality assurance and requalification of reused products and materials. And also one of the key things is having that the data to support that, which is very much sort of embedded within pre-development and pre-demolition audits. To a lesser extent, the whole area of recycle, so upcycling or increasing the value of recycling for existing built environment, there's less sort of standardization needs there, but it's also, there are some important areas. So for example, end of waste criteria to effectively determine when something can be reclassed as a product or a material as opposed to having to be classed as waste, which again links into the pre-redevelopment audits, but also testing and certification. So say, for example, a certain product group the way that the standards are set up, it sort of doesn't make it's not allowable to put recycled content in. So there could be some areas there that need work. But, you know, as I said, not as big a priority as the reuse, because a lot of work has already gone on in this area of enabling recycled content in construction products, for example. And then the fourth area is very much looking at the future, so designing for future circularity. So that includes sort of incorporating reuse, recycled content, but also future reuse and future recyclability and adaptability and flexibility. There's like multiple aspects that need to be considered. So there is an ISO standard for design for disassembly and adaptability. So it's really to sort of build upon standards like that and just to see where are the gaps. And the assessment and measurement of design for circularity is definitely a gap. So understanding, you know, how do you measure success? How do you know that you've achieved design for circularity? What's the sort of measurement and data that you're going to need to be able to have to be able to demonstrate that? Because otherwise it can be just basic. Anybody could say they've done it without necessarily being able to validate it. So there are some of the existing ISO 20887 design for disassembly and adaptability is one of the key existing standards in that area. So this is going on at the moment. So we've had these recommendations that have now been incorporated into a consultation report, which is being circulated at the moment for comments. And then there'll be another round of comments. And ultimately, we're having a meeting in September, a plenary meeting for Subcommittee 1 to decide on the proposed working group structure, taking into account the further comments received from the national standards bodies. So I'm just going to very quickly go through some of the other EU activities that are relevant in this space. That could almost like preempt some of the work we're doing in this European standards work, because, you know, the Commission is getting on with defining the policy requirements for circularity in the built environment as we speak, effectively. So one of them is there's a study going on at the moment which is looking at end of waste criteria. So if you didn't know already, the UK has got end of waste criteria. So here's an example here, which is aggregates from inert waste. We've also got flat glass and gypsum quality protocols, they're called in the UK. But these are essentially end of waste criteria. So this is something you're interested in. There's a link here to follow to find out more about the EU work that's looking at this end of waste criteria. Then another activity that could again facilitate standardization or, you know, preempt the standards is the EU taxonomy. So this essentially, there's a whole loads of money that's basically been set aside to pay for sort of COVID recovery activities and the Green Deal, all that kind of thing. And actually, but in order to make sure that money is spent in a way that supports sustainability, there's an EU taxonomy for sustainable activities. So one has already been produced for climate change and adaptation and mitigation. So these effectively for all economic activities, including construction, it sets out criteria in terms of if you can demonstrate meeting this criteria, then it's classed as sustainable and therefore eligible for any financing that comes under that banner. And we're very soon expecting circular economy criteria to be developed, and that will effectively, again, it will provide a bit of a baseline or threshold for the criteria for circularity in the built environment, because effectively the financing across the EU will be linked to that. So it's going to be a big driver for, you know, understanding exactly what the criteria is and how you ensure you achieve it and how you measure your performance against it. And then another, so the EU C&D waste management protocol, that's being revised at the moment. And again, it's a protocol, but it will form a guidance document that will be a standard in terms of, you know, what's the code of practice that should be adopted, particularly across the EU. And I thought I'll just end on this because we've just been we've talked a lot about as part of the work we've been doing. It's like an existing built environment. The pre-demolition audits, there's very likely to be some work happening on standardisation of pre-demolition audits, and what's happening this year in France could sort of act as the foundation for what happens going forward. So this is effectively a platform that's being developed, whereby from sort of later on this year, all demolitions over 1,000 square meters will have to carry out an audit and then upload their information to this platform, using standardized templates, and then they will then have to do a post-demolition reconciliation of the information. So these are the sorts of things, these platforms at a national level, these activities at a national level are very much sort of setting the scene or setting the way for standardization in either at a European level, which, and BSI tends to follow those European standards still, but then also in feeding into some of the international standardization activities, because it's a lot easier to effectively take something that's already there and adapt it than it is to start from scratch. So these sorts of examples are very important to build upon. So that's me. Thanks for listening. If I haven't put you off, if you want to get involved in standards work, then drop me an email. There's lots to be done, and there's going to be new working groups set up, as you can see. And yeah, we'd love to have more people involved in this whole scene. Okay, so that's me. Let me stop sharing and go to questions.
Thank you so much, Gilli, for this informative presentation and giving us really an overview of what's happening and standardization related to circular economy internationally, European level and UK level. It's really good and very, very related to the work of the centre. So, like we said at the beginning, either you can raise your digital hand, or if you would like to type in the chat any question for Gilli and that you might have, please. So people are maybe writing up their questions. So a lot of interesting stuff there, Gilli. You mentioned the work of CSTB in having a sort of a compulsory pre-demolition audit, which is voluntary in the UK. So do you think UK will follow suit on that? Do you think, based on your experience?
I think once somebody's done it, it's a lot easier to then point to it and say, look, they're doing it here. Because the other thing they're doing in France is they're sort of linking it into an exchange platform. So you can then sort of advertise your demolition products and materials as being available for reuse and recycling. So you can see that you know, that data becomes quite powerful when it's on a centralized platform that you can then, there'll be an API. So these sort of material exchanges will be able to sort of link into it, and there'll be other sort of applications that can use that information. So I think once it's been going for a few months, and this is why we flagged it up as part of this EU work, we flagged it up as being like potentially a real game changer, in terms of, you know, having this sort of really the standards in terms of what data you need to capture and how you need to capture it, but then also using that information to create benchmarks of performance that you can then use to set targets, all that kind of stuff. And I think, and they're doing lots of other things in France. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening in France that is really interesting. So they're probably going further and faster than a lot of other countries to embed sort of circularity in different sectors. And it's much easier to learn from what's already there than it is to come up with something completely new. I think it's even the ISO standard I talked about, you know, the design for disassembly and adaptability, that was based upon a Canadian standard. So there's lots of recycling in the standards world, because it's just, if there's something you can refer to and you can learn lessons from it, then it just makes it a lot easier, basically.
Excellent, thank you. I think we've got some questions here. So I'll start with Lucy. She said, will the report be circulated to those on the call today? I don't know what you mean by report. If it's the recording, yes. If you would like, if it's something to do with something else, please restate your question. And I think a couple of people are raising their hands. Let me read first the question in the chat by Irene. So, Gilli, do you think you're noticing any resistance to the standards?
Well, we haven't. I'd say we're sort of quite early days because we're doing this gap analysis. But I think in general, standards are quite welcomed by industry because they sort of provide a level playing field and they get rid of ambiguity. Well, there still can be ambiguity, but they then become easy to refer to. I think the greatest resistance, in fact, you have to pay for them. And then, I think that's the thing that people, I hear quite often is, oh, it's going to cost £200 or whatever for a BSI standard. So I think the resistance, and there's so much free stuff around. I think that's probably the biggest problem is there's loads of stuff you can download off the internet that could be like a code of practice or, guidance document. Why would you pay £200 for a standard? I think that's the bigger problem actually is, and the reason I've seen a question coming up here, well, you have to pay for them because obviously BSI has to be funded somehow and they're funded through people buying standards. So, if they're not actually charging for the standards, how will they then pay pay people to carry on doing the standards work? I mean, none of us get paid to do it, to be honest. Like it's all voluntary in terms of the experts that are on these various working groups, but each of them has got sort of, for example, at BSI, they've got staff dedicated towards supporting these committees and sending things out for consultation and, including all those amendments, etc. So it's not, that isn't free. It has to be paid for somehow. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's something to ask BSI, really. I've had that conversation with them. I've said, and there are lots of subscriptions. A lot of people have got subscriptions, so they're not paying like £200 per. They've just got access to all the various standards. So it's only if you just want to buy one or two that you would then have to be paying the full whack, essentially.
Correct. I think most of the organizations do that. Here at Loughborough University, they do that. So staff and students are, they can access any. So I've got a couple of attendees raising the digital hand. Let's start with the first one. Caroline?
Hi, yeah, Caroline Cochran from Mace. So I sit on the sort of contractor client side. So I'm interested to hear like what's happening and that there's all this excellent work going on kind of but it sounds like it's quite in the background and there's lots of kind of consultation and working groups. When do you expect there to be sort of standards or processes and kind of actually most interestingly information about metrics and reporting to be made kind of available, like published, made available and kind of promoted to be used, either kind of as mandatory kind of regulatory requirements or just to be out in use in the industry? Because we're keen to it now.
I know. That's why it's frustrating. It's frustrating. It takes such a long time to get things done. So I think the product circularity data sheet, and there is one. There's Luxembourg that have produced one, but it has to go through a process of being then sort of, adopted at this sort of European level. So that may come out sooner rather than later because there's an existing standard that they can adapt. And that will essentially, so some of the aspects of that product circularity data sheet are linked to, measurement. So how much recycled content is it designed for repairability, disassemblability, if that's such a word, that kind of stuff. So I think there's some things that may come out sooner rather than later, but then there's a lot of work that's happening in EN 15/4, which has got this module D, which is sort of looking at future reuse recycling. So that's already that's already been updated. That standard, and that effectively underpins environmental product declarations. So you probably wouldn't notice it, but actually, if you're looking at things like tools like One-Click LCA, once they've transitioned to using these updated standards, then they'll automatically fall in line with whatever the the updated versions are. But yeah, in terms of circularity specifically, I think it's a bit of a, I'm not sure what's going to come first, the regulatory requirements from the EU or the standards, but we're definitely looking at probably like 2 years away before anything's published in terms of standards of that ilk.
So will it
Great.
then, sorry, this is a follow-up question very quickly. Just if you're saying it's going to be a couple of years, given that the UK Green Building Council released the circular playbook, I think this week or last, and there's loads of stuff going on with Letty and other organisations around sort of publishing industry guidance kind of coming out thick and fast at the moment. How is that? How are the standards going to align with what may become industry practice before the standards come out?
Yeah, so ideally representatives from these different activities will be on the working groups or the committees that can provide that feedback directly into the standards that are being developed. I say nobody's that precious. You know, there's something that's already there and working, and it's put into the mix, and there's no reason why it wouldn't be accepted, and then it then becomes part of the standard. The issues arise where there's competing opinions. So you know, there could be something with UK GBC that's a UK perspective, and then there could be something in Germany where they've got different, or the stuff that's happening in France, you know. So it is very much a sort of a process of discussion and compromise, you know, and sometimes, you know, we can have a discussion for like half an hour about one word. It's can be quite frustrating actually, but that's because we're trying to get consensus across across different organizations and different different stakeholders that are coming at it from, and there can be some vested interests as well to get, we want our thing to become the thing that's accepted by everybody, but that isn't necessarily going to happen if there's alternative approaches that are equally valid. You have to go through this process of discussing everything, and then that's why it goes out for these consultations, and all the national standards bodies vote on recommendations or not, and then it's a sort of quite a democratic process. So if there's 14 votes come back and 10 of them are supporting and 4 of them aren't, then it's going to get accepted, you know.
I just think that the industry is moving at a pace ultimately, but I know these things align in the end, but I think that might be when you talk about the BSI not necessarily being, like, the standards not being taken up so much, and part of that is because actually kind of industry practice is almost outpacing just the publication of the standard, at which point people are retrofitting a standard. It doesn't really seem like good value for money.
Yeah, I mean, it's not perfect.
It's good. It's really interesting. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
But join the committees, and then you can put the stuff directly into the standards work. So that would be my recommendation.
Right. I'm aware of the time. Maybe a couple of more questions, I think. Irene is raising her hand. Irene, please.
Yes, hi Gilli. I work at the Circular Economy Center with indicators and assessment of circularity. So I look forward to read the report that you mentioned. But my question is more about, well, you said that you're looking at other documents and standards that try to look at the circularity, but also there are other standards and regulatory frameworks dealing with other environmental issues such as water footprints, carbon footprints, etc. And I was curious to see how you are embedding or you're drawing on these other standards for the circularity report, or if you're not doing that at all. Yeah.
Well, as part of the consultation process, so we looked at these 9 different areas and we summarised the existing standards that we knew about. And then when we sent it out, you know, across all these national standards bodies for consultation, we asked them to provide further information. So we did get back, I think we picked up most of them, but we definitely got back some new information to say, you know, so for example, in Norway, they've got a standard for reuse of concrete structures, that kind of thing. So it's really very useful to know about what's already being done. Because I say, you know, the idea is to build on what's there and not sort of reinvent the wheel. If there's something that's really good that's there that can just be adapted, then so I suppose the key thing is So anybody that's on the BSI Mirror Committee will be getting sight of this consultation document, and all of that information will be in there. So all the existing standards and initiatives and protocols that have been uncovered that are relevant to those different topic areas are listed in that document. So I would suggest, you know, I don't know whether, are you in the UK?
Yes, I work at UCL.
Yeah. So so get a hold of that consultation document, and then if there's stuff that's missing, then that's part of the process of having this you know, this state-of-the-art understanding of what's already out there that can be built upon. I stop using built environment metaphors, that can be incorporated into, you know, into the standards work that's evolving, because it will actually speed it up. I think that's the other key thing, is if we can just take something and say, okay, this is like 90% of the job done, let's just start with this, and then add some bells and whistles to it, and that will make life a lot easier and quicker, actually.
Right. I've noticed that, Feya, you were raising your hand. I know, because it's time out now. And
I did have a question, but I appreciate it's the end of the session, so I'll contact Gilli separately. Thank you.
Okay. I think we might have a Gilli Circular Economy Standards Part 2 towards the end of the year. Then maybe we will have a little bit more update. I just wanted to finish off with a question here, which is interesting, in the chat. Does it make it difficult for SMEs? Gilli?
Well, I think it was more linked to the cost.
Yeah.
And I think actually it depends, really, doesn't it? Because if we're looking at construction projects, like some of the, and say it's an SME that's part of the, you know, part of a subcontract or whatever to a bigger project, then it's quite likely that once these standards, and even existing standards, so BREEAM is a standard, so BREEAM is used to say, right, okay, on this project we need to meet BREEAM outstanding. So it doesn't really impact on the SME subcontracts or whatever. They're working to that standard without necessarily having to go out and, well, they're free actually to download the BREEAM standards. But if it was another standard that you had to pay for, you wouldn't necessarily have to buy your own copy of it, because it would just be embedded within the requirements of that project, you know, like the client requirements or some other contractor requirements. So I don't know, I can't think that's going to really impact that much SMEs unless they specifically needed to buy that standard themselves in order to do their work. So say they're a sustainability consultancy and they wanted to, you know, do work in that space, and they wanted to be able to know exactly what was in the standard, then yeah, on that instance, you probably have to bite the bullet and buy the standard. But for most other people, it wouldn't impact them, because it will just be coming through as part of the requirements or the processes that the overall project is working to. Yeah, I mean, and I do have these conversations with BSI, but I don't know, there's no way, there's not an easy answer to that, because they have to charge for the standards to be able to keep going. It's part of their business model. Unless they get a different business model, I don't know how you would then change that, to be honest.
On that note, and being 5 minutes overrun, we would like to thank very much Gilli. I know Gilli is also part of our center. She's been involved from doing the proposal development. And I'm sure Gilli will be kind enough to give us maybe a second part 2 towards the end of the year, beginning of 2024.
Yeah,
and then,
sure.
Yeah. And
might
I
do
would
the
like
case
to
as well.
thank you so much. I know you're always kind enough to help and support.